Padre Pio, a simple and devout friar who dedicated his life to prayer and the Eucharist, ended up drawing the attention of the entire world. But why did the Vatican decide to silence him and keep him away from his followers? Between secret investigations, accusations of falsehood, and a crowd of faithful willing to defy them, his story is marked by mysteries and twists. In this video, we will explore the lesser-known details of one of the most challenging periods in Padre Pio's life. Get ready to discover how the faith and obedience of one man changed the fate of a small town and challenged the Church itself. Chapter 1. The Rise of Padre Pio's Fame. In the 1920s, the small convent of San Giovanni Rotondo, located in a quiet Italian town, became the center of attention for thousands of the faithful. All this because of a friar who, at the time, was still unknown outside of Italy, Padre Pio. With reports of miracles, visions, and even the stigmata of Christ on his hands and feet, he quickly became a mystical figure that attracted crowds seeking hope and answers to their prayers. His masses became events, with pilgrims traveling from afar just for a glimpse of the friar whom many believed to be a living saint. However, Padre Pio's fame was not limited to the faithful. Scientists, doctors, and religious figures were also interested in the phenomena surrounding his life. With each new report of miraculous healing, the attention grew, as did the doubts and suspicions. Various investigators traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo in an attempt to expose what they believed might be a possible hoax. But for many, the mystery surrounding Padre Pio's stigmata remained proof that something truly supernatural was happening there. The presence of so many faithful around Padre Pio also meant a new source of income for the small town, which began to see religious tourism as a bless. Inns and restaurants thrived, and the convent received generous donations. This influx of people and money did not go unnoticed by ecclesiastical authorities. While for some local bishops this was an opportunity to revitalize faith in times of secularization, for others the situation was getting out of control. During a period when the Catholic Church faced increasing challenges, from the rise of communism to the need to reinforce its moral authority, the figure of a friar attracting so much attention began to be viewed with some discomfort by certain sectors of the Vatican. The idea that a simple friar could overshadow the Italian clergy itself led to questions arising in the corridors of power. Was this a true divine intervention, or just a collective illusion amplified by popular devotion? With each new arrival of pilgrims, the rumors about Padre Pio's mystical gifts grew. He could read souls, some said. Others claimed to have been cured of incurable diseases after receiving his blessing. But what was most impressive for those who visited San Giovanni Rotondo were his confessions. He listened to the faithful for hours on end, with a deep discernment that many called the gift of bilocation, as if he could be present in spirit in several places at the same time. This phenomenon, combined with his stigmata, was considered one of the signs of his sanctity. Yet, as Padre Pio's fame grew, so did the criticism and internal opposition within the Church. And it was in this scenario that the first investigation orders began to be discussed. But what could have led the Church to investigate one of its own members, especially one who attracted so many believers and seemed to renew the nation's faith? To better understand this story, we need to delve into the details of the investigations and controversies that would follow. Chapter 2. Doubts and Vatican Investigations. Despite all the devotion surrounding him, Padre Pio also faced great distrust from within the Church itself. Some clergy believed that the stigmata, which attracted so many pilgrims, might be a fraud. In the Vatican, whispers arose that the friar's fame could be based on exaggerations or even deceit. The Church, zealous in its doctrine and fearing that its faithful might be led by a potential false prophet, decided to act. The rumors and pressure were enough for the first investigations into Padre Pio's life and miracles to be initiated. The Congregation of the Holy Office, responsible for ensuring the orthodoxy of Catholic faith, began to closely monitor events in San Giovanni Rotondo. Vatican emissaries were dispatched on discreet missions to assess the truth behind the reports about the stigmatized friar. The investigators spoke with the devout, analyzed the reports of miracles, and observed Padre Pio's masses. But the investigation did not stop there. Secret listening devices were installed in the convent where the friar lived to hear his conversations and monitor his interactions with the faithful. It was an unprecedented effort in the history of the Church. Meanwhile, doubts also extended to the phenomenon of the stigmata. Doctors were sent to the convent to examine Padre Pio's wounds, seeking a natural explanation for what many considered a miracle. Some of the doctors sent by the Vatican suggested that the wounds might have a psychic origin or even that they were self-inflicted. But Padre Pio's response to these visits was always the same. He accepted the investigations in silence, never trying to justify or explain the phenomena that surrounded him. The friar preferred to remain obedient and prayerful. Amid growing tension, voices arose both in support and in severe criticism. On one side, there were those who believed the Vatican was making a mistake by attempting to discredit a holy man. On the other, those who saw the phenomenon surrounding Padre Pio as a threat to the Church's authority. If the friar was a fraud, allowing him to continue attracting the faithful would put the Church's credibility at risk. But what if he was truly a saint, as many believed? Ignoring the divine signs would be equally dangerous. The secret investigations, however, only deepened the mystery surrounding Padre Pio. No concrete evidence of fraud was found, but there was also no categorical confirmation of the authenticity of the stigmata. The friar continued to attract the devout, and the lines for his confessions only grew. Meanwhile, reports of healings and miraculous interventions increased, further strengthening the faith of those who believed in his sanctity. Yet the Holy Office opted to make a drastic decision, believing that silence was the best solution to the crisis. From that point on, the Church decided to impose restrictions on the friar, even without evidence to justify a formal accusation. Padre Pio was warned to limit his activities, and to many, this seemed unjust. But behind this decision was the fear that devotion to him might become a movement beyond the Church's control. The suspicion of the ecclesiastical authorities wasn't just about the phenomena surrounding the friar, but also about the power his figure represented. And this was just the beginning of an even more difficult period for Padre Pio, which we will explore next. Chapter 3. The Decision to Silence Him. In 1923, after months of investigation and internal pressures, the Vatican made a decision that would change Padre Pio's life completely. The Church authorities decreed that he should be removed from the public, forbidden from celebrating Mass outside the convent walls, and banned from offering spiritual guidance to his numerous followers. The decree was clear. Padre Pio could only celebrate Holy Mass in the convent's inner chapel, in complete silence, without the presence of the faithful who came from afar to see him. It was a heavy blow, not just for the friar, but for the entire community of San Giovanni Rotondo. Upon receiving the news, Padre Pio demonstrated his characteristic submission to divine will. When the monastery superior read the decree aloud, he simply replied, "God's will be done. The will of the superiors is the will of God." This phrase resonates deeply in his biography, as it reveals his humility and obedience to the Church, even when this decision seemed unjust to so many. For him, the silence and isolation were a cross to be borne, a sacrifice offered in union with the sufferings of Christ. The days following the decision were marked by deep sadness for the faithful who continued to arrive at the convent, only to find out they could no longer receive Padre Pio's personal blessing. Many could not understand why a man who, in their eyes, did so much good, was being punished in such a way. For the devotees, it was as if the light that shone in San Giovanni Rotondo had been extinguished. Meanwhile, Padre Pio, in his forced seclusion, continued to offer his silent obedience, praying for all those outside the convent walls. But the restrictions went beyond celebrating Mass. Padre Pio was forbidden from responding to letters and corresponding with his spiritual children, those he guided from afar through his comforting words. This isolation was complete. He who once comforted so many hearts now found himself voiceless, unable to offer the words of consolation that so many sought. It was a true test of faith, which he faced with patience and trust in divine providence. He knew that the true mission of a servant of God is, above all, to obey. Despite the Vatican's decree, people continued to send letters and messages to the friar, hoping for a response. Padre Pio, however, made a point to clarify his respect for the Church's decision. In a letter to the local bishop, he wrote, "I am deeply disgusted by the unworthy behavior of certain false prophets who speak in my name. I turn to you as a very humble and totally obedient son of the Catholic Church." This gesture showed that, above any misunderstanding, he remained faithful to the hierarchy and structure of the Church he loved so much. And although it seemed like a time of total darkness for Padre Pio, this phase of silence and obedience would lay the groundwork for an unexpected turn of events. His submission to the Church's authorities began to win over allies, who came to see in his attitude a genuine expression of holiness, However, this would not be an easy struggle. The Church maintained its decision for years, and Padre Pio's challenges were far from over. But the response of the faithful upon learning of his possible transfer showed that the story was only beginning to unfold. Chapter 4. The Revolt of the Faithful and Local Resistance. The decision to keep Padre Pio in silence and isolation was not well received by the inhabitants of San Giovanni Rotondo and the thousands of devotees who visited the convent. When rumors of a possible transfer of the friar began to circulate, the local population quickly mobilized to prevent him from being taken away. In a time when popular devotion carried significant weight, the news that their beloved friar might be removed from his convent was seen as a real threat to the community's faith. The idea of seeing Padre Pio taken away from his hometown was simply unacceptable to the devotees. The situation reached its critical point on the morning of June 25, 1923. A popular uprising took to the streets of San Giovanni Rotondo, with more than 3,000 people gathering around the convent to protect Padre Pio from any transfer attempt. The scene was tense. Peasants, local residents, and even civil and military authorities united to block all entrances and exits of the convent. People carried banners, posters, and chanted, demanding that the friar remain among them. The Vatican's decision didn't matter. To those people, Padre Pio was a saint who could not be taken away. The convent authorities tried to calm the crowd, but the situation quickly spiraled out of control. There was an atmosphere of revolt, and many feared that the protest could turn into a physical confrontation with ecclesiastical authorities. To avoid any violence, the guardian father of the convent made a plea for calm, promising that the transfer would not happen immediately and that Padre Pio would continue to celebrate Mass the next day. This promise helped to calm the spirits for a moment, but the determination of the faithful to protect the friar remained unwavering. During this tense period, Padre Pio remained committed to his stance of obedience and humility. He knew that the popular resistance, although a sign of affection and devotion, could harm him even more in the eyes of church authorities. So, he addressed the faithful, asking them to return to their homes and avoid any confrontation. His words, filled with love and respect, were, "My blessed children, now, I beg you to listen to me, as you always do, and return to your homes without harming anyone." Although the crowd calmed down, it became clear that the issue would not be easily resolved. The resistance of Padre Pio's devotees was seen as a major challenge to the power and authority of the Church. At a time when Vatican decisions were rarely contested, the reaction of the San Giovanni Rotondo community was a clear sign that transferring the friar would not be a simple task. The town became a symbol of unwavering loyalty to Padre Pio, and the improvised blockades around the convent remained for several days. The constant presence of the faithful showed that the faith surrounding Padre Pio was more than just a local phenomenon. It was a popular movement with its own strength. In response to this uprising, a commission was formed to take the devotees' appeal directly to Rome, seeking to convince ecclesiastical authorities to allow Padre Pio to stay in San Giovanni Roto. Led by the local mayor, the delegation left in early July, hoping to reach an agreement. But upon arriving in the Vatican, the commission faced a harsh reality. The authorities' decision was firm, and any appeal seemed to fall on deaf ears. Padre Pio, meanwhile, remained committed to obedience, even when the support of the devotees seemed to offer him a way out. Chapter 5. Years of Silence and Obedience. Isolated in the chapel of the San Giovanni Rotondo convent, Padre Pio spent years celebrating the Holy Mass in silence, without the warmth and presence of the faithful who once filled the church to see him. It was a period of deep trial for the friar, who accepted this cross with humility. He was forbidden from offering spiritual guidance and even from responding to the countless letters that continued to arrive. For someone whose mission had always been to be close to people, this phase of forced isolation was a true test of faith. But he knew that his obedience to the decree was part of God's providential plan. The distance from his spiritual children was particularly painful for Padre Pio. For years, he had been a source of guidance and comfort for people seeking relief from their sorrows and answers to their doubts. Now, limited by the Church's will, he could only pray for those who still waited for his comforting words. However, even in his silence, Padre Pio continued to touch the hearts of those who believed in his holiness. The mere fact of knowing that he still prayed for them, silently and constantly, was enough for many to remain steadfast in their devotion. This period of isolation, however, did not go unnoticed by those who sympathized with his cause. Many of the faithful wrote letters, organized petitions, and even published books to defend Padre Pio's integrity and attempt to overturn the Vatican's decisions. These initiatives, though well-intentioned, made the friar uncomfortable. In a letter to the bishop, he expressed his disapproval, fearing that this unworthy propaganda, as he called it, would be yet another reason for conflict with church authorities. He wished that everyone would follow his example of submission to God's will. Curiously, it was during this period of silence that devotion to Padre Pio began to spread beyond the borders of Italy, reaching other European countries and even the United States. His story of obedience and silent suffering deeply moved those who heard about him. And if you want to learn more inspiring stories of saints like Padre Pio, consider purchasing the ebook 50 Saints, Stories and Prayers for Divine Intervention, available in our store. Inside, you will find touching accounts of holy figures and powerful prayers that can strengthen your faith in times of trial. Padre Pio's acceptance of silence and isolation without complaint began to change the view of many members of the Church itself. Some of those who had previously doubted his sanctity began to see in his humility a true expression of what it means to be a follower of Christ. To many, he became a living example of resignation and faith, a man who, even in the face of human injustices, remained faithful to ecclesiastical authority. His silent acceptance of suffering was seen as an imitation of the saints of old, who faced the greatest hardships without ever losing hope. As the years went by, Padre Pio's figure became a symbol of perseverance and holiness, even amidst adversities. His willingness to follow the Church's will, even when it meant losing everything he cherished most, made many see him as a true light in difficult times. Gradually, his reputation as a saint grew stronger, and people continued to travel to San Giovanni Rotondo to pray near the convent, where he remained secluded. Padre Pio's silence spoke louder than any words, and it was only a matter of time before the Vatican realized that, even in isolation, he continued to be a spiritual force for thousands of believers. Chapter 6. The Turning Point and the Church's Recognition. After years of silence and obedience, something began to change in San Giovanni Rotondo. Padre Pio's unwavering loyalty to the Church, even in the face of severe restrictions, began to attract the sympathy of some members of the clergy and influential laypeople. His serene acceptance of isolation and his stance of complete submission to divine will drew a new perspective from the ecclesiastical authorities. Those who once viewed him with suspicion began to realize that the friar was not seeking fame or power, but rather to serve God, regardless of circumstances. Meanwhile, reports of miraculous intercessions attributed to Padre Pio continued to grow. People who had never seen the friar in person testified about healings and blessings they received after asking for his prayers. Many of these reports reached the Vatican, which was already facing popular pressure from various parts of the world to revisit Padre Pio's case. Gradually, the same documents and investigations that had been used to silence him began to be seen in a new light. The holiness of his life and the authenticity of his devotion finally began to be recognized. In 1933, Pope Pius V initiated a reassessment of Padre Pio's case, and an important decision was made. The friar was authorized to gradually resume his spiritual activities. Padre Pio, who had become accustomed to celebrating Holy Mass in silence, was allowed to publicly celebrate the Eucharist again. For the faithful, the friar's return to the altar was a moment of great emotion, symbolizing not only the return of a beloved spiritual leader, but also a victory of perseverance and faith amidst adversity. From that moment, Padre Pio became an active presence once again in the lives of his devotees, hearing confessions, offering spiritual guidance, and celebrating the Mass that so many longed to attend. But he did not return to the same scene as before. Now his fame had spread even further, and the crowds that sought him came from all corners of the world, drawn by his reputation for holiness. The small convent of San Giovanni Rotondo, which had previously struggled to accommodate Italian pilgrims, now became an international pilgrimage destination. The Vatican's reconciliation with Padre Pio marked the beginning of a new phase in his life and ministry in San Giovanni Rotondo. The Church, which had once silenced him, now recognized that he was a spiritual gift to the people. The crowds that once protested for his presence at the convent now celebrated his restoration. And in each Mass he celebrated, Padre Pio became a living example that true obedience, even in the face of the greatest challenges, always finds a divine reward. In his homilies and guidance, Padre Pio often spoke about the importance of accepting God's will in all situations, no matter how difficult they might be. He knew from personal experience the burden of moving forward when everything seems uncertain. The recognition he eventually received from the Church was not only a testament to his own virtue, but a lesson for all of us about how faith and patience can transform even the greatest hardships into blessings. Padre Pio's story is a reminder that fidelity to God's will, even when misunderstood, is always rewarded. The story of Padre Pio teaches us that true faith is often tested in moments of deepest silence and pain. Even facing accusations and isolation, he remained steadfast in his devotion and accepted every difficulty as part of God's plan. In the end, his humility and perseverance were recognized, and his life continues to inspire millions around the world. If you want to learn more about the lives of saints who, like Padre Pio, faced extraordinary challenges, don't miss the next video recommended on your screen. It will bring new examples of faith and hope that will certainly touch your heart. And if you'd like to support our work and gain access to exclusive content like live sessions and videos about other saints who made their mark in church history, consider becoming a member of our channel. Together, we can continue sharing inspiring stories like that of Padre Pio and strengthen our community of faith. Thank you so much for watching, and may God bless you and your family.